So recently, Obama decided we should arm the rebels in Syria. His justification for this was because Assad used chemical weapons in small cases. Let me repeat that. Allegedly, the Syrian army used chemical weapons in small cases, and that's justification to intervene by supplying weapons to the rebels. I am going to explain how incredibly stupid this is. First off, the justification is bullshit. About 100,000 people die, and suddenly, because 100 die specifically to chemical weaponry, that is the red line being crossed that means we can intervene. Let me see if I understand. It's okay for me to shoot and bomb tens of thousands of people, but if I gas a few dozen, that's unacceptable. Personally, I feel that maybe saving tens of thousands of lives should have been a larger reason for involvement than a few dozen being gassed, but apparently it's not important how many people are killed. The only thing that's important is how they are killed. The exact details of the method of death needs to fit inside certain regulations. Shooting people and blowing people's limbs off is allowed, but chems are a no-no. I can't begin to tell you how morally skewed this seems to me. Am I allowed to shoot up a school, but if I use toxic gas instead, only then will I be arrested? If this were actually something more than a pathetic public excuse, it would imply that 100,000 deaths is acceptable, whereas 100 is not, based entirely on method of death. To me that sounds rather silly, but in the abstract perhaps not. Here in the United States, we lose about 200,000 per year from preventable medical malpractice, and most of the public is much more concerned about school shootings or other murders done with physical weapons, which altogether add up to only a tiny fraction of our main causes of death. I talked about this in a previous video. What I think is funny is that a lot of people can notice how skewed this is for Syria, so many so that the polls indicate that the American people don't want us to help the rebels, and yet they repeat the same cognitive errors back here in America. It's okay for our own government's failures to result in hundreds of thousands of American deaths on American soil, but a school shooting is just not acceptable. After all, in America, every year, we double the total number of deaths in Syria just with our preventable medical malpractice. Obama's just applying the same logic to Syria that America applies to itself. After all, by not allowing 100,000 to die and then complaining about 100, we'd be hypocrites. Hopefully this will be a good lesson for the United States. Now on to the next segment. Let's analyze the tactical validity of this claim. Why would Assad, when he is already winning, use chem weapons when he doesn't need to, in isolated locations where they won't be very useful? Specific chem weapons that are designed for killing are generally used in larger or populated areas to rake up large kill counts. There is very little tactical purpose to using it on a small village or villages that have only 100 or so people. And depending on the type of toxin used, you risk contaminating the area for future use once your forces move in. To someone who is already winning the war, I seriously doubt it'd be worthwhile to use chemical weapons on targets that are so small when they could have been swept via bombing or rounding them up and killing them all with bullets. Bioweaponry may also require arming with hazmat to clean the area up or move through it after. These things all cost money. Why would biological or chemical weapons be used, given the hefty price tag applied to them and the numerous risks associated for a target of such incredibly low value? This is even more the case knowing it may spark public or international interest. This position basically assumes that Assad is an absolute moron. Why would he risk provoking the United States to get involved when he's already winning on a target worth only about 100 opposing lives, which would likely be more cost-effective to bomb or sweep on the ground? If he wanted to kill them all, he could have had them all bombed or simply rounded up and shot, likely at much lower expense than deploying chemical weaponry. And that's ignoring the risk of provoking outside interference, which we should know he wouldn't do. My point is that even if he was that stupid, I don't think he would have done it. Now, the most likely tactically valid reason that I see would be either as a knee-jerk option out of a desire to eliminate someone or something important, or to contaminate a village in anticipation of enemy troop movements through the area and a willingness to avoid occupying it for a longer span of time. Contaminating a village or water source would make it a region that enemy forces cannot access if they cannot access hazmat gear and travel through it. And that might be a tactically valid reason to hit such a small target with chem weapons, say if the village housed the only water source and also the only road through a dangerous mountain pass. However, Assad is winning the war. Is it really expected that a couple little villages will be the gateway to a massive pushback, so strong that it's worth risking a massive international incident and provoking outside interference? I think not. Furthermore, the latter of the two tactics is rendered pointless if the chems dissipate after a few days. I don't know which chems are claimed to be in use, and I don't feel like bothering to check, so I'm speculating. But the punchline is, I think that if this incident was actually real and not a fabrication by Obama's puppet masters, it would have been done by a foolish commander of lower rank in Assad's army who deployed them of his own accord without higher authorization. Someone dumb enough to deploy chem weaponry in this way is not likely to have been entrusted them as part of his arsenal, so this commander would likely have happened across chemical weapons, probably by capturing them, from the rebels. So even if we assume the Syrian army actually did this, we're likely accusing the Syrian army of using captured enemy weapons. That should be a red flag about arming the rebels in and of itself. Furthermore, people in the USA don't call for Obama's impeachment or for al-qaeda to be given weapons whenever some civvies get massacred in Iraq or Afghanistan. Usually there's a desire to blame the individuals behind the massacre. Blaming Assad for an incident that I strongly doubt he authorized is, once again, a ridiculous double standard. Even if this incident were true, that does not make any tactical sense as a justification to intervene. I have a strong suspicion that the incident is false, but it doesn't matter, because it wouldn't be justification in my book even if it were completely true, and even if my hypothesis on the circumstances surrounding their use proved to be incorrect. Now, some of you may be aware I previously made a video about Syria promoting an intervention. This was over a month prior, but my stance has since changed, since the circumstances have changed. I specified in the previous video that my interest was in securing the best future for Syria's people, and one of the benefits of intervention would have been stopping the rampant death. But here's the thing, that was then, this is now. Recently, the rebels have suffered a number of crushing defeats, and I think the war is pretty much over. If that information is correct, then the window of opportunity has closed. We had our chance to intervene and save thousands of lives, and we missed it. Doing something at this point will only prolong the war. The people we could have saved via intervention are now dead, and we can't bring them back. And I was slowpoke late to the party with my video on the topic, but now we find out I wasn't just slowpoke, I was hipster slowpoke. I was late to the party before it was cool to be late to the party. Because now of all times, Obama finally wants to intervene, after over a year and 100,000 deaths, right after a series of crushing defeats to the rebels, when the death toll has largely been paid and the war seems to be in its waning stage, suddenly Obama wants to help the losing rebels. Now, of all moments. Now allow me to explain why I judge the situation the way I do. I hinted in the previous video which side I'd be more likely to support when I brought up that the rebels got in bed with al-qaeda, and showed a few articles related to that. Spoiler alert, it wasn't the rebels. I'm not going to yell at Obama for waiting to see if the rebels can win on their own before intervening, and I'm not opposed to prolonging a war in another country if it suits my own interests, or if I think the losing faction would be more fit to rule and I want to support them. My problem is the circumstances and justifications. It's justified by 100 people dying to a chemical attack, which I doubt happened in the first place, and on the pretense that this was the red line, instead of intervening to avoid 100,000 people dying. This is ridiculous. Moreover, I don't think the rebels are fit to rule. The rebel factions are not a unified force, and my speculation leads me to believe that if the rebels won, another power struggle would develop with a possible result of handing the state over to al-qaeda. Obama wants to arm the rebels, but there's no clear definition as to who the rebels are. There are a variety of different groups that don't like Assad. Some of these groups fight each other, and I've heard about quite a few nasty atrocities committed by the rebels. I promote intervention under certain circumstances when it's done calmly and in a calculated manner. I do not approve of carelessly throwing money and weapons at any faction that is opposed to someone I don't like. Furthermore, I'm not sure supplying the rebels with weapons will help them enough to even stay alive at this point. Is the entire purpose of this just to make the conflict in Syria last longer? Why? To jab at the Russians? I mentioned this in my previous video on Syria, but there's a bunch of nations with some sort of interest in this. It's a political web, and I'd only sanction tampering with it if it was done patiently and with discipline. And isn't it convenient that suddenly we need to do something about Syria? Suddenly it's front page news, right after the Prism Leak. As soon as Obama can conveniently benefit from something for the hounds in the media to pay attention to, Syria gets thrown to the wolves. It's not like we cared about it a few months ago when thousands of people were dying. I mean, did these 100,000 deaths happen yesterday? Maybe I'm a prophet, and when I heard about this on the news in Syria, it was all in advance. Those weren't really articles or videos. I was just being given visitations by a deity who wanted me to warn the people of the coming tragedy. I don't think the claim about Syria's chem weapons is true, nor would I think it's justification to intervene even if it were. The justification is saving lives, and quite simply I think that's a lie. I don't support the rationalization that the enemy of my enemy is my friend. The enemy of our enemy is a potentially useful tool, and should be helped enough to fulfill their purpose in our grand designs. But that does not make them our friends. And I don't sanction replacing a tyrant with another tyrant when you know well in advance that the replacement will be even worse. There is no taking a chance for the Syrian people here if the rebels are not fit to rule. I'd become involved if I found it served my calculated interests. One of my interests would be consideration for what's best for the Syrian people, which I think is a secular society focused on education with critical thinking, medicine, and the free flow of ideas and information via bringing them into the information age. So when thinking about supporting the rebels, I have to ask, are they capable of bringing about this goal? And I think the answer is no. So unless I'm given a legitimate reason to simply prolong the war in Syria and degrade the state of the nation further, I don't see myself supporting intervention at this point. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.